I'd like to begin by thanking AIJAC, especially at this point in time. I wish that we had in Washington, D.C., organizations with the efficiency and the moral clarity that AIJAC represents in Australia. And as we see the disaster unfolding within American policy, and by all means, this is a bipartisan disaster, the voices of those, parallel voices of those such as AIJAC, are so sorely needed in Washington, D.C. I'll start with the bottom line up front. This is a disaster of our own making. It was not inevitable. While Joe Biden will talk about how the United States has spent $2 trillion and we've lost thousands of people, over the last 5 years, we've lost fewer people in Afghanistan than people, I live in Bethesda, Maryland, than people who have been killed in automobile accidents in Bethesda, Maryland. Our investment in Afghanistan on a year-by-year basis isn't much more than it is in South Korea or Japan or Germany. So in effect, while I will criticize the nation-building emphasis of the early years after 9/11, and I would argue that that was a mistake, what we had very much was just an amplifying presence of our troops, which formed the backbone and enabled the Afghan military to do what needed to be done to hold the Taliban at bay, and they had done so remarkably well. For Joe Biden to get up and say that the Afghans didn't have the will to fight ignores that more than 68,000 Afghans died fighting, and those are just the Afghan army troops, in addition to the policemen, in addition to civilians. It ignores that we had trained the Afghan army to fight while we provided air cover, while we provided logistics, and while we provided intelligence, and we very much just pulled the carpet out from underneath the Afghans by cutting off those capabilities. When I talk to friends of mine in the Afghan government, and I have many friends in the Afghan government, what they say is, look, if the Americans are going to take a political decision to leave, that's fine. But you don't need to kneecap us on the way out. You could have just left. I'll get a little bit more into the problems with the deal and the problems with the timing of the withdrawal in a moment. But I want to actually give a little bit more of a broad picture, so to understand about why some of the actions which are being taken beyond the United States are occurring. So the first thing I want to do is talk about why Pakistan supports the Taliban and why it's not realistic to expect that Pakistan would stop supporting the Taliban. Pakistan, of course, is an artificial state, as artificial as they come. It was created as a state for the Muslims. But think about it. The word Pakistan itself is just an acronym. P stands for Punjab, A stands for Afghan, K stands for Kashmir, I stands for the Indus River Valley, S stands for Sindh, and so forth. And it's also a pun because Pak is the local word for pure, so land of the pure. And it was a multi-ethnic state, which was supposed to be an Islamic state. But there was problems in Pakistan among its various ethnic components. The Punjabis dominated society, and they discriminated against some of the other ethnic minorities. So in 1970 and 1971, the Bengalis in Bangladesh, which at the time was East Pakistan, decided to secede. They no longer wanted to be part of Pakistan, and they broke away. So overnight, Pakistan lost half of its country. And what the Pakistani military did at the time, and the Pakistani intelligence service, they argued that, these ethnic divisions are no longer irritants which we can absorb. They're existential threats to our country. And so what we need to do is promote radical Islamism. We've got to promote jihadism, because by promoting jihadism, we can make it the identity that will unite all Pakistanis. How does Afghanistan come into play with this? Traditionally, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan was always under dispute. And many of the Pashtuns who live in Pakistan wanted to join Afghanistan. So let's fast forward to 1979, the Soviets invade. everyone says, hey, look, the Americans created the Taliban. That's nonsense. The Taliban were created in 1994. You can criticize the CIA as much as you want, but they're not in the habit of training kindergartners. They're not in the habit of training 4 and 5-year-olds, because that's what the Taliban were back in 1979, 1980. But what happened is that while the Americans provided the weaponry and Saudis provided the money, the Pakistanis distributed, and they only distributed to radical groups. So over the course of that time, the resistance became very Islamized, and society in Pakistan, in Afghanistan changed. Now, the warlord, which the Pakistanis supported, was a guy named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who's still around. And to some extent, the CIA supported him, but quickly abandoned him back in the early 1990s when we decided, in the 1980s when we decided he was just a sociopath. The Pakistanis supported him. And when the Soviets withdrew, you had Pakistan and these warlords, these Islamist warlords, all divide up the country. And there was a civil war. And people in Pakistan and Afghanistan didn't like it. In 1994, you had 2 schoolgirls who were walking to school near Kandahar. They were abducted by one of the warlords and taken to the camp where they were gang raped. Local villagers came to one of the madrasas, one of the Islamic seminaries, and asked the mullah there, Mullah Omar, for help. And he said, I'll send the students, the Taliban. And they conducted vigilante justice, hanged the warlords who were responsible for this, and rescued the girls. And so this became wildly popular. It was an indigenous vigilante movement, which then Pakistan co-opted when they saw how powerful it was, or how popular it was. And between 1994 and 1996, they steamrolled through the country. I was actually in Mazar-e-Sharif in 1997 when they attacked the city in the north. And the lesson there was, when I went to sleep, they were 100 kilometers away. When I woke up, they were knocking on the doors of the city. And the reason was the Taliban seldom win military victories. They cut deals. And this is just in Afghan culture. Seldom do you actually have to fight the actual battle. People will see who has the most firepower and then either fade away to live and fight another day or defect to the winning side. And so the Taliban collapsed rapidly after 9/11. And when we pulled the carpet out from the Afghan forces, without fighting many battles, they actually steamrolled through the country. What's unclear now is whether they're going to be able to hold the country. We already have Amrullah Saleh, the former vice president, and Ahmed Massoud, the son of one of the most lionized Afghan fighters, consolidate control in the Panjshir Valley and start attacking other provinces around it. So we might be at the end of the beginning rather than the beginning of the end. At the same time, many of the neighboring states which don't trust the Taliban, the Iranians, the Uzbeks, the Turkmens, the Tajiks, might reactivate their own ethnic warlords, and we might have a reversion to what Afghanistan was back in the 1990s with different warlords controlling different areas. But let's talk about the big picture. The Taliban is to the Pakistanis what Lebanese Hezbollah is to the Iranians. You wouldn't have one without the other. The Taliban are wildly unpopular. People don't like living underneath them, which is why they never wanted to take part in intra-Afghan dialogue and take part in an election or coalition government, because they realized that they wouldn't have that sort of popular support. That doesn't mean the Afghan government was popular, but people do remember what the Taliban was like. Now, what are the implications of what President Joe Biden did? We empower Islamists. And the fact that the Biden administration initially timed the withdrawal for the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks is just stupid beyond belief. I talked to someone on his National Security Council, and they were beyond themselves that someone at the top had come up with this decision, and everyone was simply afraid to say to the man on top, this is the wrong move. Fortunately, they walked that back a little bit, but we still see the Pakistanis crowing triumphant, and they should. One of the things I worry about in the long term is every time you've had a country which has supported Islamic radicalism for export only as part of their foreign policy, ultimately, you've had blowback. It happened in Saudi Arabia. It happened in Syria. It happened in Turkey. And it's going to happen in Pakistan. And the problem in Pakistan, which is already a weak government, is you have the loose nukes problem because Pakistan has nuclear weapons. So this is the big danger that we need to worry about moving forward. But there's also the issue. Consider that when Reagan, after the Marine barracks bombing in 1983, when Ronald Reagan subsequently ordered the withdrawal of US forces from Lebanon, he had no idea about what the ramifications of this would be. He had no idea that some random Somali warlord named Mohammed Aidid would use this as inspiration to attack American forces in Somalia, and that led to the Black Hawk Down episode. Nor did he realize that the son of a Saudi construction magnate, a young boy named Osama bin Laden, would see this and determine that he too could strike at America. I'm afraid right now it's open season on the United States, not just by Russia and China, and my God, I worry about Taiwan right now, but also by second-rate powers, countries like Turkey, countries like Pakistan, countries like Venezuela that might decide to take pot shots at Americans because they think they can. I worry now about the normalization of betrayal. Again, make no mistake, this is a betrayal, and it was a betrayal we chose to do. It wasn't necessary. But it's not the first time. Under Donald Trump, we betrayed the Syrian Kurds. And every time we betray a local ally, it makes it harder. I mean, it signals that it lowers the stigma associated with it in Washington. And at the same time, it signals to everyone around the world that you can't trust the United States. And God knows what's going to happen in the next, basically the next conflict we find ourselves in. How are we going to try to get any local forces to support us? Now, let me talk about the deal. When Donald Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made this deal, I was very, very critical of it. I was critical enough of it and public enough with my criticism that I actually got called by a principal, one of the top officials in the Trump administration, and chewed out at home for 45 minutes on my phone. And my wife was in the room and she said, but don't they realize you don't work for them? And evidently they didn't care, nor frankly did I, because it was simply a bad deal. And the reason why it's a bad deal was a number of issues. First of all, it cut the Afghan government out of the negotiations completely. It was just a deal between the United States and the Taliban. And so we're making a deal over democratically elected government. There's no better way to delegitimize a partner than to do something like this. A parallel to this is Korea, where for decades, North Korea tried to negotiate directly with us and tried to purposely get us to cut South Korea out of the negotiations simply because they wanted to delegitimize the South Korean government. Eisenhower was too smart to let them do it. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and so forth. But unfortunately, we made that mistake with this deal. Second of all, the deal forced us to release, or we agreed to release, 5,000 battle-hardened Taliban prisoners. And again, remember that the Afghan government wasn't a party to this deal, but we were forcing them to release these guys who turned around and then started killing members of the Afghan government. That's a betrayal. The Taliban promised that they would disassociate themselves from extremist groups like Al-Qaeda. This was never realistic because it's not just disassociating from two different political movements, but it's cousin disassociating from cousin, brother disassociating from brother. And we caught the Taliban red-handed violating the deal. We killed, or the Afghan special forces killed, 2 leaders of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. And therefore, we know that the Taliban violated the deal. Did Joe Biden have to uphold this? Did Trump tie his hands? And the answer to that is no. After all, Joe Biden walked away from Donald Trump's position on the Iran deal and reinvested in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. He broke Donald Trump's deal with the Keystone XL pipeline between Canada and the United States. He broke the deal we had with Mexico with regard to the border wall. Now, you can oppose all those policies which Donald Trump made, but the fact of the matter is Joe Biden is simply passing the buck. You can't break any number of deals and then say, well, with Afghanistan, our hands were tied. The way I think we need to think about the Taliban right now, because too many people in various think tanks, and I saw an article from the Lowy Institute, which was just incredibly naive on this, will sort of take up the Northern Ireland view. You have to make peace with your enemies. The Irish Republican Army and the British government did it. The way to think about the Taliban ideologically is they're like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. I mean, Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, can just wave his finger and say they're going to be a pariah state, but they don't care. And while the Khmer Rouge were in theory Marxist and the Taliban are Islamist, they also do both share sort of an anti-urbanization, anti-cosmopolitan sort of ideology as well. When I was in Afghanistan, when the Taliban ruled the country before 9/11, they were much harsher in cities like Ghazni or Kabul than they were in the countryside. And to make an American analogy, I'm not sure what the appropriate Australian analogy would be. Imagine that some guys from the backwoods of West Virginia, like think back to the movie Deliverance, found themselves in charge of Berkeley, California, the hub of liberalism. And they would go over the top to crack down on that liberal culture. That's sort of like what the Taliban do in cities like Kabul or Herat or Mazar-e-Sharif. Now, the problem with the withdrawal, just practically, even if we were going to make a decision to continue with this, why didn't we time the withdrawal for the winter? Remember that in Afghanistan, there's a fighting season. That fighting season goes from spring to fall, because in the winter, after the first snowfall, the mountain passes, especially between Pakistan and Afghanistan, become impassable because of weather. The Taliban retreats to their Pakistani safe havens, and the winters have always been peaceful. If we had timed our withdrawal for the winter, it would have given the Afghan government the ability to simply plan and be ready for that eventual fighting season. Instead, we did it in the middle. One of the problems we see now, for example, with the chaos at the Kabul airport, why did we give up the Bagram Air Base? This is what a lot of the military officials say. It had a defensible perimeter. It wasn't in the middle of the city, and it had more than one runway. Now, what I worry about, and this isn't the context which the media is saying, we have 10,000 Americans remaining in Afghanistan at least. And the White House is signaling we might not get them all out. Well, this is the worst hostage situation imaginable, because it's not going to take long before the Taliban decide that they are going to bargain with the lives of these 10,000 Americans to try to release the $9 billion, which we have frozen from the Afghan foreign reserves and so forth. And this can play out more with other countries. And, you know, for folks like Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, for folks in Al-Qaeda, for others, this is a dream come true. They can humiliate the United States in a way that the United States hasn't been humiliated. They can drag this out. And this is what we're now facing. And the frustration, of course, is this is because of our own incompetence and also an egocentrism and a navel gazing in Washington that doesn't really understand the ramifications this has on all America's allies, from Israel to the Gulf states to Australia to the Baltics to Taiwan to Japan and so forth. Why don't I end there? I hope I've been provocative enough. I've tried to give some of the big picture. I've also tried to go down into some of the details. But I'd be happy to address anything else in questions or answers.
Thank you so much for that fascinating introduction to our webinar today, Michael. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that there's quite a few questions out there. You can use the reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen to use the raised hand feature. That'll provide me with a silent notification of your intention to ask Michael a question, and then I'll call upon you accordingly and we'll control your microphone and your camera. So the first question will go to, as usual, to AIJAC's Dr. Svi Fleischer.
Thank you, Michael. That was brilliant and fascinating. I guess my question is, what do we do now? You've painted a picture of a terrible disaster and an avoidable one. America has put itself in a very bad position. If Mr. Biden or Tony Blinken called you up and said, look, we've stuffed this up, what do we do now? Could you help us? What would you say they have to do?
Okay, well, first of all, there's a conceit in Washington that we can always make bad decisions and somehow extricate ourselves from them. The analogy I would make is if you purposely decide to drive a bus off a cliff, as the bus is plummeting to the rocks below, you don't say, hey, do we have a plan B for the passengers on board? But, so I mean, in many ways, I think that we've already gone too far. But in answer to your question, I would not recognize the Taliban. I mean, it may sound beyond belief, but there's some discussion in Europe and elsewhere. Well, the Pakistanis are doing it. The Chinese are doing it. Maybe we can bargain with them over human rights. You know, I think you need to have some moral clarity and side with folks, for example, Amrullah Saleh and Ahmed Massoud, who are now in the Panjshir Valley and regrouping. At the same time, why the hell is Pakistan a major non-NATO ally? I mean, when I was doing research for my book, Dancing with the Devil, which is a history of American diplomacy with rogue regimes and terrorist groups, I interviewed Assad Durrani, who was one of the heads of the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence service. And he openly admitted that the Pakistanis were playing both sides. They were charging the Americans exorbitant rates for logistical passage through Pakistan. And at the same time, they were supporting the Taliban. And they were making billions and billions of dollars doing it. I would sanction Pakistan. Pakistan, and for that matter, countries like Turkey, deserve to be state sponsors of terrorism and designated as such with the sanctions that accompany that. Likewise, we've got to stop protecting them when it comes to the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, which is the international body which counters money laundering and terror finance. They've been on the gray list for the last several iterations of FATF meetings. They deserve to be on the blacklist based just on objective criteria. So I do think we need to start pressuring Pakistan simply because, Pakistan was always a problem. It's as much of a state sponsor of terrorism as Iran is, but now they are arrogant and because they believe that they've defeated a superpower, and frankly, because of our own choice, they have.
Thank you for that, Michael. I'll now hand over to Federal Member for Fisher, Mr. Andrew Wallace.
Thanks very much, Joel. And Michael, thank you so much for your presentation. Just on that last point about the West sanctioning Pakistan and Turkey, doesn't that bind them together with other problematic states that really just throws petrol on the fire, is my first question. The second question is, from an Australian government perspective, if you were sitting across the table from Marise Payne, what advice would you give her now?
Okay, first of all, it's pouring here. And so I'm getting some interference on my side. I hope you're not getting interference on your side.
We're good, Michael. We can hear you clearly.
Okay. Well, Andrew, I only heard about every third word of what you said, but I think I got the gist of your questions. On the second one, I wouldn't deign to advise what Australia should do, but I would argue that when America is at a period, is in a period of retrenchment, and when the isolationist wave is heading towards the United States, as the pendulum often goes in Washington, it's important for America's closest allies, and I include Australia there, to really give Americans a pep talk. The way Margaret Thatcher, for example, once told George H.W. Bush when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, "Don't go wobbly on me now, George." That's the type of wake-up call that the United States needs to hear from all of its allies, including Australia. They need to do it privately, and frankly, they need to do it publicly. That's the answer to your second question. When it comes to the first question about Turkey, and I think the question was, why did I lump it in with those problematic states?
Sorry, no, it was more if the West sanctioned Turkey and Pakistan, doesn't that throw fuel on the fire?
No, I would argue it doesn't. First of all, Turkey is, when it comes to Turkey, we've already done this before. When Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, had seized an American pastor, Andrew Bunsen, Donald Trump sanctioned Turkey, and despite Erdogan's bluster, the currency crashed. He released Andrew Brunson. Frankly, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is all bark, no bite. He threatened Israel, for example, after the Mavi Marmara, and said there would be no reconciliation with Israel until Israel fulfilled three demands: lifting the siege of Gaza, paying reparations, and apologizing. Put aside the reparations and the apologizing, which I think were misguided, but Israel went ahead and did them. Israel never lifted the siege of Gaza, and Erdogan simply moved on. Sometimes when you have a schoolyard bully, you've got to push back on them. When it comes to Pakistan, Imran Khan isn't particularly strong. At the same time, the Pakistani economy isn't particularly strong. I would argue that the United States has tried to accommodate Pakistan over the past several decades, and Pakistan has responded by consistently working to kill Americans. It's time, if not to use sticks against Pakistan, which I'd argue they deserve just on an objective reading of what a state sponsor of terrorism is, or what someone who engages in money laundering and terror finance is. Pakistan deserves that. But on the other hand, look, Pakistan borders one of the world's largest democracy. So at the very least, instead of saying to Pakistan, we're going to offer you $7 billion in aid, what we should say is, unless you get your act in order, we are going to give India a qualitative military edge over you in every way, shape, and form when it comes to drones, when it comes to missiles, when it comes to other high tech and so forth. I think it's time that we, again, recognize the moral clarity here. And of course, the Quad is part of that.
Thank you, Michael. I'll now hand over to AIJAC's Naomi Levine.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think you've been really spot on and equivocal in your comments this morning, and I thank you for it. I wanted to ask you about the Taliban's PR campaign that they've been on the past few days. It's been very interesting to watch. They've phoned into the BBC and, they're sort of making overtures that this time it's going to be different. What do you make of the PR campaign and those claims?
Well, we'd be foolish. Look, I guess it was Albert Einstein. It's often attributed to him, once quipped that the definition of insanity is doing the same action repeatedly and expecting different results each time. In 1996, when the Taliban invaded Kabul, castrated the former president, dragged him publicly through the streets, and then hanged him from a lamppost, that was against the backdrop of Taliban spokesmen saying that they wanted an intra-Afghan dialogue. And everyone would have amnesty, and they weren't going to seek revenge. We're hearing the same exact arguments or the same exact talking points right now. And what we see in the street is that the Taliban, thanks again to Pakistan's ISI, has listings of all the Afghan special forces who worked with the Americans. They're going to door, raping their children, and then killing this special force veteran in front of the families. This is not something which, I mean, we should not believe the Taliban PR right now. And one of my frustrations, and this is something which I had been talking about in my articles going back several years as I was criticizing our special envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, who, by the way, before 9/11 actually did business with the Taliban in oil pipelines and so forth. That's something that most Americans have forgotten, but God knows the Afghans have not. We appointed Zalmay Khalilzad because from the superficial Washington mindset, he's an Afghan American. He understands the languages. He understands the cultural nuances. He's the perfect envoy. What we never understood was that the Afghans didn't see him as a neutral party. And frankly, he never was a neutral party. Putting that aside, when I would demand from people like Zalmay Khalilzad, show me the evidence that the Taliban have changed, we'd never get a result. We never get an answer. And what's worse, because Zalmay Khalilzad monopolized US policy, whenever anyone like Hamdullah Mohib, the national security advisor of Afghanistan, or Amrullah Saleh, who's now the vice president of Afghanistan, at the time he was the interior minister, wanted to go to Washington to talk directly to congressmen, they'd have their visas denied because the Americans were so worried. The State Department was so worried that they might say something that would shake the narrative, which Zalmay Khalilzad was speaking about. And by the way, this isn't just limited to Washington or to the Afghan government. Zalmay Khalilzad repeatedly refused to brief the government of India as he was negotiating this peace talk. Zalmay Khalilzad likes to go on the conference circuit. And one of the big conference circuit things, you have the Munich Security Dialogue, the Halifax Security Dialogue. You also have the Rasina Dialogue in New Delhi. And Zalmay Khalilzad went to that. And at the end of the Rasina Dialogue, he was going to go back and fly to wherever he was going to fly to. His Indian minders, instead of taking him to the airport, took him to the foreign ministry. And that's how India, against his will, and that's how India got its first briefing. So sorry, I went off on a tangent, but I would basically say, no, don't trust, and certainly you've got to verify.
Thank you, Michael. I'll now hand over to Anthony Cohen.
Thank you, Mike.
Got you now, Anthony. Go for it.
All right. Thank you, Michael. You've been very enlightening. I've got a double question, if I could. And believe me, I love America with all my heart. But isn't the elephant in the room the fact that you've got a leader who doesn't know the difference between the floor and the ceiling, and a deputy who would not be much, would probably be even worse? And when it comes to these sort of things, leadership is paramount. And you've got another 3.5 years of this. And I just see America being dragged down the drain because of this leadership. And the second point I'd like to bring up is, shouldn't we really be putting a lot of effort into strengthening as much as possible India?
Anthony, Mr. Cohen, I missed what you said about the elephant in the room, but I understood your criticisms of the leadership. And I would agree with you with regard to the criticisms of leadership. I've never been so worried, and both among my Republican friends and my Democratic friends, people are just beside themselves right now at how badly this was mismanaged and how to this day, Joe Biden seems not to understand the seriousness of the issue, nor for that matter, some of his chief deputies, such as National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. When you're giving a press conference, don't say, we're going to get out as many Americans as we can. What you say is, we are going to be there until the last American comes home, until every Afghan who served with us comes home. That's what you say. And this administration doesn't get it. I've got to say, in Washington, the talk of the 25th Amendment is starting to percolate. And that's not simply because of a policy discussion with regard, a policy disagreement with regard to Joe Biden's policy, but the fact that he's effectively been absent without leave, going on vacation in the midst of this, not doing press conferences, not taking questions. The same is true for some of the others. Simply having, I mean, what was astounding to many people was that he hadn't called NATO allies or Australia, having Jake Sullivan do it. A 45-year-old former aide to Hillary Clinton, he may be national security advisor, but that's not appropriate. Joe Biden needs to do it. I wrote an article, and I was a never Trumper. I disliked Trump immensely, but at least some members of the Trump administration had shame. When we abandoned the Syrian Kurds, Jim Mattis resigned. Brett McGurk resigned. Numerous other Trump people who couldn't abide by his policies resigned. We don't see that in the Biden administration, and that worries me deeply as an American. With regard to your second question on India, absolutely. I mean, I'm not going to belabor the point. I just say, yes, absolutely. We should be doing much more with India. And despite our problems with Modi, despite Modi's populism and so forth, we've got to see the forest through the trees, stay out of Indian domestic politics, and see the big picture here. And finally, Anthony, I would just add very quickly, Pakistan has effectively become a vassal state to China. And they are so heavily indebted to China, it's unbelievable. And you could just Google any article about the China-Pakistan economic corridor on this. Taliban is a vassal to Pakistan. So the way I tend to look at the Taliban is they're a vassal of China once removed. And China wants to have the dominant interest in the country to block India and the West from accessing Central Asia and so forth. I mean, China is playing a great game and the Americans are playing solitaire.
Thank you, Michael. I'll now hand over to Richard Whitman. Just unmute yourself there, Richard.
Yep, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely a really excellent presentation. Must thank you all for that. My main question would, what do you see as the outcome of this withdrawal in relation to Israel's security, and even in this area to Taiwan, please?
I missed the word before, security. In relation to what security?
Israel's security.
Israel's security, okay. Yeah. With regard to Israel's security, Israel certainly shouldn't trust the Biden administration, but that happened. I mean, look, we're at the point where no country should, I hate to say this, no country should predicate their own national security and their existence on the word of the United States. Israel doesn't need to, because Israel presumably has a nuclear deterrent. And certainly they've achieved a qualitative military edge over many of the countries in the region. Let's talk about Taiwan now. I wrote an article a few days ago and I wrote one last year, and I'm not afraid to say it. I don't think Taiwan will be safe unless Taiwan somehow acquires nuclear weapons. It's something that I'll be pilloried for saying in the nuclear nonproliferation community, but we can't expect Taiwan, a country of 24 plus million people, to fall on its own sword so that we can pretend that the word of the United States will matter when it comes to China and China's ambition. China has openly taunted Taiwan now that the United States isn't going to come to their defense. And then the United States made that worse when Joe Biden, I believe today, either today or yesterday, in trying to defend some of the ramifications and criticisms, said, look, Afghanistan is fundamentally different from NATO. It's fundamentally different from our commitments to Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Well, technically, the United States hasn't had a voice commitment to Taiwan since 1979. And so someone in the State Department, a senior State Department official, helpfully spoke to the media and clarified that Joe Biden didn't mean to say Taiwan, that our policy hadn't changed there. So in effect, that's signaling that the United States doesn't consider Taiwan to be in the same category as NATO, Japan, or South Korea, and that itself is dangerous. Remember, the Korean War started in 1950 after, I believe it was Secretary of State Dean Acheson gave a speech about the American defensive perimeter in Asia and omitted to mention South Korea or Taiwan. I'm sorry, South Korea or the Philippines.
Thank you, Michael. I'll now hand over to AIJAC's Jamie Hymes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joel. Thanks, Michael. It's been fascinating so far, and will continue to be so, no doubt. I'm just wondering what the effect of all this is likely to be on the various countries in the Middle East. Like Iran, for example, has a very ambiguous relationship with the Taliban. It's been known to shelter Al-Qaeda fighters, while at the same time there's tension because the Taliban persecution of Shiites, and then there's also the effect on the moderate Sunni states in the Middle East that rely on the US for its security to an extent, and no doubt are very nervous about all this. And then there's also the possible impact of the US plans to pull out of Iraq. So I'm just wondering how you see this impacting on the wider Middle East. Thanks.
Okay, great question. First of all, with Iran, Iran wanted to play it both ways, much like Russia did. They didn't want the Taliban to win, but they didn't want the Americans to win either. And so when I say the Americans here, I mean the broader NATO mission, Australia as well. They wanted us to bloody each other. Now, I think they're not so happy. And look, privately, I'm in touch with some Iranian diplomats, some Iranian officials. That's not a secret. I don't sympathize with them, but I do, since I'm a private citizen, talk to pretty much everyone, even people with whom I fundamentally disagree. Now, the Iranians, I will suspect, will try to create a buffer in Western Afghanistan, much like they had under Ismail Khan previously. That means the three border provinces of Herat, Nimruz, and Farah. Now, when I go to Afghanistan, the place where I used to hang out was Herat. And so I'm very comfortable talking about that. It feels, I mean, historically, it's an Iranian city up until 1857. It feels still like an Iranian city. And you're more likely, people are oriented economically toward Iran. They use the Iranian currency. They're listening to Iranian music. They might not like the Islamic Republic, but culturally it's very Iranian. And this is going to be a problem for the Taliban and creates an opening for Iran to create a buffer in these areas. So if we're talking about new warlords, we're talking about a renewal of a civil war, at least until the unofficial divisions within the country are hammered out. The Iranians had also hoped that with the American withdrawal, that Chabahar would come into play. Chabahar, of course, is a port which the Iranians had built, and they had initially, the Indians had wanted to work with them. Ultimately, now the Chinese are working with them, but geographically, it's only about maybe 160 kilometers from Chabahar to the Afghan border. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Iranians will try, for very economic reasons, to try to do something in Western Afghanistan, which will enable any country that wants to support resistance to the Taliban to work through Chabahar and to help support that port. But let me get out of the weeds. When it comes to the Gulf states, before 9/11, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were one of the three countries, along with Pakistan, that actually recognized the Taliban regime. I don't think they're going to do that again, because fundamentally a lot has changed in the last 20 years, and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are on the other have changed their orientation when it comes to sponsoring jihadism the way they once did. Now, what I worry about, the historical analogy I would make in the Middle East, is to, I guess it was Sir Anthony Eden's East of Suez speech. When was that? Around 1968. And then in 1970, the British withdrew from the Gulf. Most of the bases the Americans have in the region, for example, in Bahrain or in the United Arab Emirates or in Oman, we got as a result of the British leaving. And the Americans were there to fill the vacuum. But now that the Americans talk about a pivot to Asia, and during his address, Joe Biden said, we've got to fight the wars of the future. We've got to be positioned for the threats of the future rather than the threats of the past. Fine. He's pivoting out of the Middle East. I'm not so sure he's pivoting to Asia, but even so, if you're pivoting out of the Middle East, who fills that vacuum? When the British pivoted out, the Americans filled the vacuum. When the Americans pivot out, who's left? The Russians, the Iranians, and even if that's not our intention, the fact of the matter is all the countries in the region remember 1970. Remember that swap between British and American influence and realize how fast a power can decline. And they're going to start making their accommodations with other countries in the region, for example, Iran. So the United States has long found Qatar's relationship with Iran to be a little bit problematic. Expect Kuwait and perhaps even the United Arab Emirates to start acting in the same way. I mean, I know a lot of people are fond of the United Arab Emirates and Dubai, and I spend a lot of time there when I'm in transit, unfortunately, I mean, in the past to Afghanistan or Iraq. They see it as a pretty progressive place, not in terms of being a democracy, of course, but in terms of its foreign policy. But if you actually look back, I believe it was this past February, on the anniversary of Iran's Islamic Revolution, this was the first time that the authorities in Abu Dhabi publicly congratulated Iran on the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. And to me, what this signals is that even within Abu Dhabi, that they're starting to understand they need to make accommodation with the other side because of the vacuum which the Americans are creating.
Thank you, Michael. I'll now hand over to AIJAC's Oved Labelle.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for doing this. Just going off your previous statement on the pivot to Asia, and given the justifications that were given for the Afghanistan withdrawal, what do you think the future presence in Iraq and Syria look like next year?
Well, I mean, I'm a frequent visitor to Iraq, and I've actually taken my daughter there. That's a whole nother story because she got to meet the head of the Badr Corps, the pro-Iranian militia. Having a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old debate him was surreal. At any rate, when it comes to Iraq, the Americans are planning to leave. We might not admit it publicly, but that's the gist I got. And I did see the Prime Minister, Mustafa Kadhimi, in Washington when he passed through a couple weeks ago. And with regard to Syria, you know, Joe Biden was today at a press conference, and this just goes back to the whole 25th Amendment issue. And the 25th Amendment, of course, is when a majority of cabinet members determine that the president is no longer physically or mentally fit to hold office. We're far from that at this point in time, but the fact that people are discussing it is worrisome. That trial balloon has been launched. At any rate, Biden today said we didn't have any troops in Syria. And then the Pentagon corrected him and said, you have 900 troops in Syria. I mean, again, he's the commander in chief. If the American troops are in harm's way, he should have a basic understanding of this. But in Iraq, I'm afraid that Biden's denial about how bad the situation is or his responsibility for it could lead him to make the same mistake twice. What Biden has said when he's confronted with the images coming out of Kabul is this would have happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 15 years in the future. No matter when we left, we were going to see scenes like this. I disagree with that, but if he's that fatalistic, nothing's going to stop him from doing this when it goes to removing troops from Iraq. And one of the things that frustrates me, last December, I spent a lot of time in southern Lebanon, including in Nabatea, which is basically in the heartland of Hezbollah. And I was talking to former Hezbollah when I was there, I met the head of Hezbollah's construction agency, who is basically the Revolutionary Guard's chief guy in southern Lebanon. But at the same time, when I was talking to some fighters, some municipal workers and so forth in Nabatea, they were all complaining that Hezbollah had betrayed them because of financial hardship. The Lebanese pound had crashed. Hezbollah didn't have money because of the maximum pressure campaign on Iran. Hezbollah had decided to change the payment for its members from dollars to Lebanese pounds. And so overnight, their salaries declined 90%. And you had, alongside of that, about 80% of the people leave Hezbollah. They were only in it for the money. The rest were the ideologues who stayed behind, but Hezbollah had never been so weak. And then we start giving financial relief to Iran. Now, if we pull out of Iraq and we allow the Iranian-backed militias to really project their control over the whole country, we're going to have a major problem in terms of the financing of some of these groups, especially terrorist groups. One thing that a lot of people don't understand. Today, too many people think that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps finances the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. That's no longer the case. The Iranian-backed militias in Iraq finance the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They've set their claws into businesses and so forth in Iraq, into import-export. They are able to avoid some of the sanctions that exist in Iran, and therefore the revenue which they're able to develop in Iraq actually flows back into Iran. If we give them a further monopoly, if we reduce our forces in there, we're simply going to be empowering the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran even further. It's not just about Iraq, it's about the relationship between Iraq and Iran.
Thank you, Michael. I'll now hand over to Dr. Ranpurat.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay, hi. Fascinating discussion, really amazing. Two quick questions. One about the relationship between Hamas and Taliban. We've seen that the Hamas has congratulated the Taliban. They met with them in Qatar before that. And two, about the issue of refugees that's coming out of Afghanistan, but is becoming sort of widespread around the Middle East. We have refugees from Syria into neighboring countries. We have the issue of refugees across the Middle East becoming a real issue. If you can comment on these two issues.
Okay, first of all, Hamas and the Taliban might come from different, if you will, pedigrees within Islamic theology, but they've arrived to a common point in terms of their terror. They may have slightly different sponsors, but they have far more in common. If you draw the Venn diagram, they very neatly overlap. That said, when it comes to pragmatic links between the two groups, I'm going to have to defer that question to others because it's not something I've looked into much. When it comes to the refugee flow, bottom line up front, refugees are destabilizing. And what we need to be worried about is not just the humanitarian aspect of the refugees, but how various governments in the region will try to weaponize those refugees. We see this already with Turkey trying to win concessions over Western partners and the European Union by threatening to unleash the floodgates. At the same time, there's been problems with Belarus recently, as many refugees somehow get channeled into Belarus, and Belarus actually gathers them and facilitates their entry into, I believe it's Lithuania, in order to sort of destabilize NATO there, destabilize the Baltics. So we have the refugee problem, the humanitarian problem, but we also have the more cynical problem of people weaponizing these refugees and holding them hostage for their own political designs.
Thanks, Michael. We'll go to Colin for the penultimate question.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thank you for such a frank and illuminating discussion. A couple of quick ones. Just go back and explain to us again how the Afghan forces collapsed so quickly. The more general question is, will this be a wake-up call, do you think, for the US administration on the big issue of Iran and the JCPOA negotiations and so on? Will they take stock? And finally, Israel, will it enhance the Abraham Accord membership and association and potentially extend it, or potentially threaten it, undermine it?
Let me do the second question first, Colin. When it comes to the JCPOA, the Biden administration is desperate. Rob Malley is desperate, but the ball isn't solely in their court. The Iranians have a vote on this, and the Iranians, no matter how sycophantic Rob Malley may be towards them, no matter how obsequious he may be, nothing is enough to appease Ibrahim Raisi at this point. And the Iranians kind of figure they're almost at weapons grade uranium. The JCPOA allowed them to have ballistic missiles. So the US might, desperately continue to try to pursue a deal, but I'm not sure the Iranians are interested in that. When it comes to the Abraham Accords, fascinating question. And unfortunately, again, they're caught in the political dynamics of Washington, in which the Biden administration has seemingly wanted to undermine them to some extent, simply because they weren't theirs, to redirect to the strategy that was conventional wisdom in Washington, frankly, in Australia and in Europe as well, before Trump came into power, which was funding the Palestinians. The road to peace leads through Jerusalem. The Biden administration still upholds that. They're not willing to allow the evidence to impact their policy. That said, your broader point there, as US leadership declines, and as trust in the US leadership declines, could that actually and ironically paradoxically strengthen the Abraham Accords? And the answer to that, I would say, is yes, in the future administration. Now, the big question, to go over how the Afghan forces collapsed so quickly. Momentum means everything. It wasn't as if the United States left and we left an even playing field. What we did, number one, was abandon the chief ally, which the Afghan army had, but the Taliban maintained their chief patron, Pakistan, which gave them logistical support, which gave them weapons, which gave them safe haven, and so forth. We undercut the compact which we had made with the Afghan army, in which they would fight, but we would logistically help them get to the fight. We no longer provided that service. We would provide them medevac service. So if they were wounded when fighting, we would take care of them. We no longer provided that. We would give them intelligence, and we would give them air support to bomb the Taliban positions. They could call in airstrikes and so forth. We gave up that capability when, for very political reasons, we decided to leave the Bagram Air Base and retrench ourselves in Kabul. Now, again, in Afghanistan and through Afghan history, oftentimes the armies won't meet on the battlefield. They will take a sense, they'll put their finger up into the wind, get a sense of which way the wind is blowing, and base their decision about whether to appear in battle on that or not. And so the Afghan army decided that the momentum was against them and that they hoped to live to fight another day. Now, where the American intelligence failure comes in is evidently the Taliban have been striking political deals with some of the military commanders and some of the political figures in Afghanistan for over a year for this very day. And the CIA didn't detect it. Now, what makes this even scarier is both the Trump administration and the Biden administration predicated their withdrawal on the fact that it would still be able to maintain their intelligence. And the Taliban and the Pakistanis ran circles around us. So the strategy was never going to work. The only silver lining there, Colin, is that as quickly as the Afghan army fell, the Taliban too might also fall, should either the United States or a neighboring state be it Iran, be it Uzbekistan, be it the Indians, whatever, decide to actively support one of the other power brokers, again, such as Ahmed Massoud or Amrullah Saleh, who are now in the Panjshir Valley, which the Taliban have yet to conquer, and frankly, before 2001, never themselves conquered.
Thank you, Michael. And now I'll hand over to Jeremy Jones for the final comment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. This is a question, obviously, I mean, the question you've been addressing today is on all of our minds. We see the distress of the people in Afghanistan. We see the pain affecting the members of the Afghan Australian community who have friends, family, and are really scared for the future. We see the problems of allies of America wondering what is happening for all the reasons you've outlined today. And we have the concern about how international terrorists, our enemies, not just of America, but of all our values, are feeling at the moment. So it is wonderful you were able to present to us, but I'm only going to ask you now, if there is anything you would like to say in conclusion. What should we be looking at in the near future that might give us an insight about how this is going to pan out in the next few weeks, months, and years?
Okay, well, Jeremy, I mean, I have no good news. All I would say is that it's essential that organizations like AIJAC keep speaking out in Australia so that Australia has the moral clarity and actually tries to hold Washington's feet to the fire. Living in Washington, it's too easy, and it's American pastime to ignore the rest of the world and to figure that with oceans on both sides of the United States, that somehow we are insulated from the rest of the world. And we all know that is no longer true. We need another moment, again, like Margaret Thatcher telling George H.W. Bush, don't go wobbly on me now. But when it comes to terrorism, I'm afraid we've just opened the floodgates. We have shown that jihadism works. We've shown that allying with the United States can be a lethal mistake. We've encouraged not only great powers, but lesser powers to take pot shots at the United States and perhaps its allies. We need to be on guard. We need to be much more robust in our defense. We need to stop the moral equivalency, which so blights our reactions in the United States and elsewhere. I mean, the stakes have never been higher right now. I can't underline just how great a disaster strategically and morally this is, and how we can't even imagine the ramifications that are going to emerge from the mistake which Washington has made, starting under President Trump, but certainly most recently concluding under Joe Biden.
Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, I'll wrap up. And on behalf of AIJAC, thank Michael so much for the short notice and also for a fantastic and thoroughly enlightening presentation today. We're all better off for it. And with these unfolding events, it's fantastic that we can turn to you and to your analysis. I'm sure on behalf of not just everyone at AIJAC, but also the audience today, we thank you very much.